Hey everybody, welcome back to Terminus, the Dante's Inferno of extreme metal podcasts. I am the death metal guy, aka she was desperate to nibble on his pectoral man slabs.
And I am the black metal guy, aka we believe that we invent symbols. The truth is that they invent us. We are their creatures, shaped by their hard, defining edges. Or man slabs.
Yeah, I was about to say. So they did. There was a meeting of the minds there.
Yes, yeah.
What was your book?
My book is Shadow of the Torturer, which is by Gene Wolfe. It's actually from the series that the show gets its name from.
Oh yeah. Terminus Est, right?
Book of the New Sun. Terminus Est is his executioner's sword, which is weighted with a mercury, like literally mercury or something like it, that shifts the weight towards the tip as it falls.
Shift the weight toward the tip, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
No, that's good. My book is Nicholson Baker's House of Holes, which is an extremely entertaining and bizarre. People call it an erotic novel, but it's sort of like erotica as told by Dr. Seuss. It's a very strange and very funny reading experience.
Interesting.
So, all right, guys, we're not going to do a lot of preamble.
Yeah, let me bookmark that for later.
Yes, absolutely. It's actually it's really charming. I'll talk to you about it when I'm done with it. This is my second read. So not a ton of preamble today, guys, because as you can see from the title, we have a bear of a Terminus 2021 style episode. We've got 4 full lengths that we're doing full reviews of. We'll see if we survive to the end. If you really want to show your appreciation for the cruelty we're about to do to our own old aching bones, you can help support us by following us on social media. Me, the Death Metal Guy, on Facebook at Terminus Podcast, or the Black Metal Guy on Instagram at Terminus Extreme Metal. And if you're especially dedicated, you can subscribe to us on Patreon, where $5 and up gets you access to the Terminus Prime bonus episodes, as well as the Terminus Black Circle, our private Discord server that today was dominated over the politics of wearing flip-flops in public. Which...
It's strictly haram.
Well, there is a unique pattern emerged depending on where you were from in the United States. That the Mason-Dixon line firmly determines whether you're allowed to or not.
Hail! This is Brandon from Cromlech, and you're listening to Terminus.
All right. A couple of weeks ago, I was on Instagram, and everyone who we follow had posted the same nebulous vortex of lightning in their stories. And I was like, whence cometh this vortex of lightning? And then I looked into it, and cometh it from Iniquitous Barbaric Synthesis by Impetuous Ritual, out now on Profound Lore. So this totally snuck up on me. God, what would I say about this? It's like, Impetuous Ritual was maybe my baby's first no riffs band. Like, it was an example of, a band doing a very extreme texture and timbre first kind of thing that I had a chance to listen to carefully and be like, oh, I get what's going on here. This is cool. So, for those who do not know, Impetuous Ritual is part of a trio of bands. One being, the most famous being Portal, and the other, probably about even with Impetuous, being Grave Upheaval. And it's really the death metal guy who in his notes started making these comparisons, and I think it's relevant. This is a crew of guys who you can tell that this music is it's very idiosyncratic music. It's obviously not easy listening or everyday music. And you can tell it's the process of a group of friends who are really interested in certain very specific ways of making music, especially like the play between obscurity and legibility, right? And in each of their bands is based on the idea that the surface is completely sonically indecipherable. It's like it just sounds like a morass of loud shit. And under the surface, there's a ton of detail. But each of them is done very differently, right? So where Portal is basically the most classically death metal, right? As they did on, like, I think, what was it, Volt? They took away the distortion, and people just heard a bunch of kind of interesting, weird death metal riffs played more cleanly. So, like, under the things that sounded like, falling backwards up a flight of stairs, right? There was something a little more classic, but carefully composed going on. And so that's their death metal band. Grave Upheaval is more like either their doom death band or their war metal, like goat, like it's almost like their fucking arch goat band. Would that make sense, death metal guy?
Yeah, that's fair. I would also argue that Grave Upheaval is just for like sort of goofy take, it's the world's fastest funeral doom band.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, it's slow. It's extremely down-tuned. It has some kind of wugga grooves to it, right? But so does Funeral Doom.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's got it's concentrated almost solely on timbre and atmosphere. It pushes the sort of distortion arms race to the furthest degree.
It also, in a sense, might be the most decipherable, because it's the simplest, so you can kind of hear changing power chord riffs.
Yeah.
And because it's slow, it's not blast beat centered.
Well, a lot of it is blast beat centered, but even that is like so blurry and played so quickly, it's operating at, quarter note, whole note timescales.
For sure, I get what you mean. Yeah, and also presumably lots of the old Archgoat half blast. So Grave Upheaval is cool too, but I just remember, so of these bands, Impetuous Ritual is, it's technically a war metal band, but in this group of bands in this set of bands that this group of friends does, this is the black metal band, basically.
Yes.
It focuses much more, they're still pretty heavy low end if you listen on headphones, but it's focused, but that's more like the kick and the bass. It's focused way more on upper mid-range and treble. And what you're going to get is a howling cacophony that, if you listen more carefully, as I did in my buddy's car in probably like 2017 or something. So I probably listened to Blight Upon Martyred Sentience. I think that was around then. Maybe earlier. Maybe it was Unholy Congregation. If you listen closely on good speakers, you'll hear that this squall of noise is coming from a bunch of pretty intricately interlacing squiggly leads. So it's sort of the method of Conqueror, but Conqueror is actually, I think, more noise-focused. And this stuff is a little more written. And often, the thing that's fascinating and maybe frustrating about it also is that it is it's written like Portal, it's written to not make sense.
Yeah.
Once you start making out the riffs, you'll realize that all of the emphases fall in exactly the wrong places. And what you thought what you thought you could identify as a troped drum pattern and lock onto was actually like 3 measures too long or whatever, It's very detailed, and there's something daring about this because they put a ton of work into the writing, and then they just let it go as something that virtually everyone will hear as a shitstorm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's also pretty comparable to who was that Kolkata band that we covered the other day?
Oh, interesting. That was Kal Nagini.
Kal Nagini. Yeah. There's something similar in the DNA here and there.
Yeah, Kal Nagini is more riff-oriented, but the central riffing mode is this totally blown-out, crumbling low end, which I think is at the bottom of the mix here.
Yeah.
As far as those bands, this might be a little closer to Tetragrammacide in the sense that it's got that, like...
Yeah.
but it doesn't have the industrial vibe that Tetragrammacide has.
Yeah.
So this is it's a difficult pill to swallow. I think Impetuous Ritual is very cool, but I also think it's a pill that can be swallowed too easily. Right? If you're if you're, a guy who likes his crazy metal, right? It's pretty easy to throw this on and be like, hell yeah, this is loud, right?
Yeah.
And it's supposed to, I get it, haha, it's supposed to be loud, and it's supposed to be unlistenable, and that's why it's cool, and you can say that to your friends and laugh at them, right? And, I mean, don't get me wrong, there's a basic pleasure in that. But we want to try to figure out what's going on here beyond the meme, and, is it worth a closer listen or not, and if so, why, right? And I think I like Impetuous Ritual in part because it sort of turned me on to this method of writing. I think the death metal guy, you were not that impressed by this record.
It's all right. I think the problem for me centrally with this is I get a lot of what this album is doing from Brutal Death. And in Brutal Death, it's usually playing around with timbres and rhythms and stuff that I just kind of find more inherently pleasing. I think this is an interesting record in that it's doing a lot of black metal stuff and it's doing a lot of Brutal Death stuff simultaneously.
Yeah, that's true.
And the Brutal Death is, very clear, especially on the first, 6 tracks of this record. But nobody who... buys colored vinyl, listens to a Brutal Death band. You know what I mean? So there is something about this that is to a slight degree like an aesthetic rewrapping of stuff that I prefer in other locations. I don't think it's bad at what it's executing. I'm not convinced that what it's executing is that interesting, because you described it as sort of your first no riff war metal band. I would say there's definitely riffs. It's just that I don't find them personally that interesting, at least until we get to the back half of the record where things really pivot in a substantial way, and I find that material a lot more interesting.
Yeah. Well, I think I was being a little facetious by no riffs. I think the whole thing was I listened to it on some good speakers, probably better speakers than I currently have, and when I did, it sort of you could hear that there were actually a bunch of riffs.
No, I understand that.
Yeah.
I guess what I'm saying is that it's there are a lot of riffs, and they are highly detailed, but maybe my suggestion is more that, if you break down the riffs into, their most meaningful phrases, into the sort of root notes between the squiggling, you get something that's really not too far off of an incantation melodic sense. Which sort of strikes back to the roots of Cavern Core itself, and Impetuous Ritual is sort of one of the primary bands you would describe with that tag, to a degree.
I guess so. I always associate it with a more booming low-end sound and more reverb, clang. I associate it with less frenetic music.
Yeah, no, definitely, but I would say that Portal was obviously very important to establishing the sort of sonic space of that style, and Grave Upheaval...
I would say Grave Upheaval is the closest, and
Grave
they're just
Upheaval
one of the best
is
at it.
just what I say is, the best Cavern Core band. It's just sort of it's sort of the first and last necessary note for that style.
I think Urkalian Oracle was also really good.
Yeah, there's a few.
They have similar sounds. They're sort of slow, massive, chord-oriented, monolithic, as opposed to like.
Yeah. This is definitely less skronky than Portal. Which I appreciate because I've never really enjoyed Portal. It's like I love lots of horrible, noisy, dissonant stuff, but I'm not really going to a what is fundamentally a sort of old school death metal band for that. Excuse me, but we should talk about the structure of this record, because I think that's pretty important. I don't want to get caught up too much in the material that I don't really like off the first half and end up dismissing the stuff that I do like off the second.
For sure, yeah. I mean, I definitely like to hear your take on, as I was listening the second time, I could hear all the brutal death, and was like, so I'd love to hear you comment on that in the samples. And yes, there's definitely some sort of narrative feel going on in this record, where once we get to Psychic Necrosis, which begins just before the midpoint of the record, but basically is the midpoint, and the longest track, that track accomplishes a kind of metamorphosis where there start to be a lot more riffs. And the riffs aren't really, like you were saying about the more brutal death stuff, the riffs are actually kind of familiar. They're just being delivered with the insane tone quality and performance intensity that we've come to expect from this band.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
They sound like basically mayhemic black metal.
Yeah, there is a lot of very direct black metal stuff on the back half of the record, and I think it's probably the strongest material on the album.
Yeah.
It sort of begs the question of so if this band is a death metal band trying really hard to do specifically black metal things, why not just do the black metal and skip the sort of tortured process to get there? And I think that when they do that, they're really strong. And it's interesting listening to some of those black metal ideas in this very strange context. And I think that there's something to really dig out there that's potentially exciting. But there's not really a good time to bring this up, but another kind of brick wall I run into on this album is the production. It's not that it's too noisy for me or too chaotic. It's that it's, at least to my ear, sort of too smothering. Obviously there's tons of noise and feedback, but there is it ends up creating an odd softness to the sort of sonic palette. Really intense blast beats end up kind of getting covered up by bellowing vocals. It becomes hard to get, real rhythmic contrast just because the edges of notes blur together so much.
Keep going.
Yeah, no, so I think that's part of the problem that I have is, you've got this very frenetic, intense music that is highly detailed, but you're essentially listening to it through a pillow. And it just ends up sucking a lot of the energy out of it for me. And I don't usually complain about production this much.
Yeah, well, I get it. That's an interesting point. So it's, I think we've talked about this before with bands in the cavernous or noise-worn metal spectrum in general, that there is a kind of diminishing returns effect with noise production.
Yeah.
Right? There is a point past which things become less heavy. And I've talked a lot on this show about the brutality or heaviness of clarity of form, right? And even just, or the virtues of even, whether that's just clearly demarked riffs like in Spite Extreme Wing or in brutal death metal, as you would say, right? This intensely just sort of crystalline patterns, or in, watery guitar tone in Graveland, right, without any distortion. There's some string instrument sound, right? We've talked about how there can be a kind of intense heaviness or aggression in tones that aren't noisified, or at least not noisified like this. I feel like there you're running up against the central conceit of the band, which is this idea that it's supposed to be a obscure and sort of massified or liquid surface that conceals structured depths, right? That's the game being played. But I get what you mean, that, like, I think it's fair to say that, like, maybe the listening experience just isn't as satisfying as it could be, right? Like, you might, even though you're saying that what you hear in the first half of the record is kind of standard for Brutal Death, if you heard it with a clearer production, you might be like, hey, I like Brutal Death, I like this.
Yeah, or if I heard it live. I bet this is really cool to hear live.
Oh, they're a great live band. The videos of them are insane. They wear loincloths, which basically look like diapers. And somebody has to have told them that these basically look like diapers, and they just don't give a fuck.
That is kind of cool.
Stand on stage headbanging in their diapers, covered in war paint, making music that sounds like this. Can you imagine the security guards?
Another great night at the local.
Yeah, exactly. So.
Well, let's get into some samples, because we've got 2 off the front half of the album and 2 off the back half, which should better explain the pivot that's made toward more sort of atmospheric doom territory.
Yeah. The other thing I wanted to say real quick about the production is that some people in the comments say it's their clearest.
Okay, I will be curious.
Although, based on what I remember of the older stuff, that sounded clearer. It was easier to pick. I couldn't do the picking out riffs thing as easily with this. So I wonder if that's actually true, or if what they actually mean is that the songwriting has more clearly marked riffs, like the way in the second half of the record it focuses in on certain chorded riffs. You know what I mean? Like, I'm not sure it's actually a function of a clearer production. The production might be more obscure. But the writing...
I'll have to do some A/B testing to see who's right.
Yeah, so let's see. Let's listen to about 11 minutes into the record. This is my sample. This is about a minute into Necromantic Assurance. Okay, so as far as outlining what happened there, that's one of the more, I think, concentrated action moments off the first half. Mm-hmm. And that we got the, it starts off with this, like, right? Which, I don't know, how would I describe it? I don't know the music theory for this term, but it's like, they're not really... I talked a lot about those 16th note runs that are in, Brutal Death.
Yeah.
It's kind of like that, but it's more like pulsed dyads or so. Dyad probably isn't the right word. Duplets.
Well, they're doing... They're doing a weird sort of polyrhythmic thing between the drums and the guitar rhythm, where they're doing these sort of like fast triplets sliding across the surface of like a 4/4 blast beat. It's a very, so specific to brutal death. What this really sounds like is a lot of Colombian brutal death. The stuff that tends to be...
Oh, the slippery stuff.
Yeah, the really slippery stuff where the guitars feel like they kind of fall out and back into phase with the drums. If you listen to that stuff, you'll hear a lot of that. And also, this is my first time actually hearing this one on headphones. I was listening to this on speakers, prepping for the review. And I've started to realize, okay, so part of the thing with the production... So these guitars are unusually hard panned to the sides. Like they might be 100 or 75 pans, and usually you do 50-50. It's like it puts them out to the side, but it's still centered enough that you don't get that weird negative space in the middle. But the problem with that is the guitar tone that they're using is like a really boomy. I think they're using sort of deliberately cheap, sort of overdriven and chained metal zone pedals or something like that. No, because I've heard this tone before, and I've heard this tone on Enmity's record, Illuminations of Vile Engorgement. I think
which is one of your favorites.
Which is one of my favorites. But I've also realized that the real thing, the way you fix the production, is just by bringing all the drums up like 4 decibels. You know? They're really pushed down, at least for my taste, and I think putting them in more direct competition with the guitar would make for something more well-rounded.
So you wouldn't have to neuter the guitar sound at all. You could just crank the drums.
I think just crank the drums, because, you know, the guitars have that strange sort of clippy square wave quality that you get from some of those cheaper metal zone pedals. And that's kind of cool in the sort of on-off binary switching sound that they have, where most of the tone color has been extracted from it. So I don't really mind that. I just think that I would just even out the EQ a little bit on this whole thing, and maybe that would make it work better for me.
That makes sense, because in music like this, if it's going to work, the drums are usually your guide. Right? If you can't make out the guitars, you can follow patterns centered on the drum. You can follow rough tone and timbre patterns that are centered on or warped around the drums.
Yeah.
And having those subdued there, I can see what you mean. In part, like, right, it's hard for me to even fully describe the beats, right?
Yeah.
You do, right, you know, after that, but basically, like, you can sort of follow what's going on. You have that sort of, like, pulsed, maybe 3 against 16 or whatever feeling, and then you do this, like, this, sort of more traditional 6/8 chug with a weird turnaround that's in a different time signature. And we get one moment with a clearly standing out guitar line, right? Which has that... Was that when you were like, oh, these are metal zone pedals?
No, I could hear it from just... I mean, I can't confirm that it's like metal zone specifically, but this just reminds me of certain kinds of low-end guitar pedals that you massively overdrive, which is sort of part of the contributing factor to that, like... 2000s early digital production, like home production death metal sound that people are starting to work with again and do weird stuff with.
Yeah. So anyway, that's a good example of the fact that even though it is genuinely pretty hard to hear what the riffs are there, except for that one moment where the guitar leaps out, it is a moment of, I would say, pretty intense musical action, where if you are listening to the guitars and the general, or the drums and the general contours of the guitars, there's a lot to get your hooks in, and it, I think, successfully feels pretty wild.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to say that they don't stick the landing on the conceit. I mean, this all does feel very chaotic and harsh and extremely aggressive, and the technical performances are all super on point. Also, I don't know where to stick this, but comparison to Antediluvian in certain weird ways. But for me, it's just, I think that it's just sort of...
There's similar riff rhythms and overall riff shapes, but Antediluvian is way more interested in the riffs.
Yeah. I guess really... really it comes down to a matter of taste. This is just like sort of more trod territory for me in other places, so it doesn't really have the bracing quality that I think a lot of people get from this band. I think that Impetuous Ritual, not for you, but for a lot of people, is going to be like possibly the first band they've heard that sounds like this, or or does this. Now, there's a lot of guys doing it, but they all have dead women on the album covers, and not like a cool abstract thing. So it's a different culture.
I get that.
Yeah.
Although, in a sense, this is... I get how you're like, okay, it's annoying that the plebes don't associate this with brutal death, but in a sense, they are doing, as a band, one thing that both of us have talked about as important, which is reintegrating brutal death with the broader... with the rest of extreme metal.
That's fair.
I don't think the band is trying to pull one over people.
No, I'm not saying that at all. I don't want to suggest that this is like some sort of crafty rebranding of brutal death.
Right.
More that it's just like the musical techniques that for a lot of people probably seem really novel are already out there, just in like different places from what you would expect. Now, the thing is,
fair.
As sort of negative as I've been, I don't necessarily dislike any of this. I mean, this is all pretty listenable. So I'll actually go to my sample, which is off the following track, Grail of Enmity, which is the last or second to last track in this sort of first half dozen songs that operate as sort of a suite altogether. They all sound relatively similar, they're all paced in a relatively similar way, and then it's kind of up to you to determine what's your favorite. This one's mine. I think it's the best of the early tracks on the record, just because there's a little bit more to hang on to, and the song structures are not so deliberately labyrinthine and difficult to follow. And I think when it's a little bit more approachable structurally, it allows me to engage with the intended atmosphere more. So right from the beginning, Grail of Enmity, we'll check this one out. Okay, so I really like this one. I think this is like the strongest of the opening tracks, and in the notes I wrote not by a wide margin, but I think actually, yeah, by a wide margin. There's something about this song where all the ideas sort of link up with the main conceit of the band, but executed in a way that's a lot more approachable for me. So you've got the opening riff, which is sort of like a very harmonically complex second wave riff, sort of like leading into the 2000s stuff. I like that a lot. Big preparatory fill, and then we're into the brutal death territory. And I actually said while I was playing, there's one short riff they play like 4 times that's definitely like a Cryptopsy riff. So they're referencing a lot of stuff that I like. But
dude, the first riff is kind of like fucking what was I gonna say? That never mind. Keep going. I'll remember it. Sorry. Autism.
No, it's all good. Yeah, so I mean, this also kind of strikes back at some of the weird stuff we've covered on the show that I really like the if you remember the Tiradero de Cadavres record.
This part does sound like Tiradero.
Yeah, which is if you guys. That was a couple years ago. If you guys haven't checked out that episode or something, that's an awesome band that put out a really cool record that combines black and death metal in a really interesting way. But I think the thing to really concentrate on here is that, yes, it's very brutal death. Yes, it's extremely aggressive. But the song structure is blocked out in a more coherent way, and it actually feels heavier to me like that. It's kind of like you said... with production, there's diminishing returns on heaviness past a certain point of noise. I think there's also a diminishing point of heaviness when you get into certain, like, totally labyrinthine song structures.
I mean, for sure.
Like, there's a lot of spazzy, brutal death that I really like, but I'll acknowledge is not nearly as heavy as a lot more straightforward brutal death stuff. So I think that Impetuous Ritual has it in them to do kind of cool, engaging songs that still belong to this core artistic conceit, but it's almost like war metal priors are getting in the way, if that makes any sense.
Like the riff has to not make sense.
Yeah, like the riff has to not make sense, and like everything has to be linkable to Conqueror in some way, because there's like really cool just like archgoat parts in this song. I think that part of the main conceit of this band is a certain kind of structural incoherence, and I think at this point, that's hitting points of diminishing returns, and they're just better when they're in a more firmly structured mode.
Okay, I think I can agree with that. It's like the other stuff is they've made some records like that, and they don't really have anything to prove on that front anymore.
I was about to say, it's like you have 3 prior records. Like, right. We know you can do it. Yeah.
Right. And so it's, in that case, like, I mean, I think the band that is dedicated to riffs not making sense is Portal.
Yeah, yeah. And Portal is like, I'm not a big Portal fan. Portal is extremely demonstrative with its whole vibe.
Yeah, but I think Portal did something pretty unique and nailed a totally off-the-wall kind of atmosphere that had not occurred to anyone. Like, it's,
Okay, I can agree with that. I guess my argument is just that I think it's more of a dead end than a lot of people.
Yeah, no, do I want to spend much time there? No. But, like, in some sense, it's like, it really is horrifying bad trip music, right? But
you're happy that it's out there somewhere.
Yes, it's artfully nonsensical. It's somebody taking the Lovecraft thing very seriously in a very different way from Morbid Angel, right? Mm-hmm. I think it's artful and cool and haunting, and it's also a very complete package, right? Because it is that odd artwork. But I guess what I'm saying is, like, in some way, the wildest riffs early on this record are not that different from Portal riffs, although they're played more as, say, spindly leads than sliding chords, etc. Right? They're not that different from Portal riffs. They have similar ways of sounding nonsensical, right? Like strange points of emphasis, complicated multi-time signature phrases, things like that. Why not keep the Portal stuff in Portal is, I think, a fair argument, right? Like, you can have a band that is just, like, really powerful and makes sense.
Yeah, yeah.
like it's okay to have the band that
You've got two that are powerful and don't make sense.
Exactly. Like, although I'd argue Grave Upheaval kind of makes sense, right? It's like, you know,
to a certain kind of mindset.
It's got heavy riffs. I mean, Portal. I don't think Portal is that heavy, right? That's the thing. Portal is not like power music.
Yeah, and Grave Upheaval is like very heavy, especially when you're like a death metal guy who listens to a lot of harsh noise and power electronics, and it makes sense in this sort of like atmospheric music concept.
Yeah. It's also very much about timbre. This is, I see what you mean. Like, this passage is just like cooler than the passage I played. I think that's just like, and in part because it does sound, it is a lot more legible. But it still has this kind of elusive, it's still not easy to break down.
It's still, right? Even at its most coherent, it's still crazier than 99% of everything. So it's like, that's fine. Let's sacrifice,
exactly.
Let's sacrifice 1%, you know? Like,
exactly. And so I feel like that is the basic impulse that this album is following. It just is not quite all the way there yet, right? I think what you're pointing out is maybe they are clinging to their past form, right? Mm-hmm. Right? We wanted to do this sort of like blistering, indecipherable, barbaric scribbling noise, and that's important. We can't do an Impetuous Ritual record without that, so we're going to have the first half be like that to a T, maybe some of the most intense we've done, right? And then we're going to start leading things in a new direction. And once it goes in that new direction, all the distinguishing features of this album start to pop out.
Yes, and that brings us to the second half.
Yeah. So, Psychic Necrosis is a very long track in which a lot of things happen. I can't do justice to it with one sample, but I will take one sample from it. This is, like, we're going to about, at this point, just over the halfway mark of the whole record, just under halfway through the track. It's, here's maybe the moment. They make some effort to integrate the two halves of the record, right? There are some more legible parts on the first record, like we heard on your last sample, or like one moment on mine.
Yeah.
But, like, they are pretty separate. There's not like a build, there's not a continuous build. Here is where there is like if there's a definite turn anywhere, it's here. Dude, okay, so there's a good example of how if the riffs make more sense, the whole can sound even crazier.
Yeah, yeah.
The fact that you can pick up on discrete phrases there makes it easier to tell the way they're being, like, distorted and decomposed over the course of a run. So the basic method there is that every time you hear what sounds like a stable riff, it actually starts going... It starts sort of disintegrating or shifting on the second iteration, right? You'll hear like 4 reps of a riff, but each rep is different, and it's like you're listening to it crumble or calcify or something, right?
Yeah.
It's like, not like it's decaying in a weak sense, more just like it's being horrifically mutated, right? Also, like, you'll hear there's a bar, like, there's a part that's just sort of sliding bar chords. You can recognize some of it as almost dark funerally, right? Or early Watain type, gothic sliding chords. And then on the next repetition, there's the same basic figure, but it's like only certain notes are being accented, and it's all the most dissonant tones, so it's almost more like a death metal riff.
Yeah, they play with, like, the chord voicings.
And it just keeps crumbling out, right? Or and then that just turns into a right? And when they go uncompromising on the total noise front, that's really cool, right?
Yeah. And honestly, what this really strikes me as is, like, pretty directly from late Mayhem, like, newer stuff.
You mean, like, after Declaration of War?
Yeah, like Ordo ad Chaos on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was thinking Mayhem would come up, like... And, well, here's another one, right? In the last riff we hear, right, there's this sort of, like... Dun, 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 dun. I can't even hum it, right? There's a sort of familiar sounding black metal riff that sort of processional rhythm, almost like a Gorgoroth riff, right? Dun, 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 dun. Like a more neoclassical feeling. And as it goes on, it gets more notes in it, and the entire rhythmic structure changes, and it's starting maybe where in the middle of the other riff as it ends. They do a lot of very cool stuff with having two guitarists and, I don't know, like, many guitar... Although they really just have... Yeah, they do have 2 guitarists, one of which does vocals, and just many tracks, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I definitely want to get back to what you were saying originally, though, about the... Again, we have another example of, like, increased coherency making it more potent, and not changing the atmosphere that they're going for at all, but actually accentuating it. It is, like you said, it sounds crazier when they play more coherently.
Yeah, that's what I was trying to sort of give examples for. It's like, because there are more discernible riffs here, you can hear the way the riffs are being distorted and manipulated. And you can hear how unusual it is.
Yeah.
Right? And it's also still, they never really drop the beat. There's not like a deliberately self-undermining rhythmic stagger, right? It stays really heavy throughout.
Yeah, it's just that battering archgoat shit, but with weirder harmonic context. Mm-hmm. So let's go to the very end of the record. And, like, very end, where we go to metempsychosis. And here's where it all came together for me, and I realized all the way on the back end of this record, it's like, oh, they just want to do black metal, Mm-hmm. And actually, this song features some of the most direct and most melodic black metal riffs, and again, it makes it sound crazier, because there's moments of, like, sincere melody on this track, which, exist in such stark contrast to everything else, and it ends up being one of the most gripping and intense parts of the record. Obviously, yes, there is something to be said for having 40 minutes running up to this to congeal this sort of, like, state of frozen terror in the listener or something. But I think there's ways to weave this in more substantially into the fabric of the band's music across a whole record that would just make for something a lot cooler. So let's check this out and check out the fucking Graveland riff that comes in out of nowhere.
Ooh.
And there you go. Impetuous Ritual can be the world's most advanced black metal band if they just commit to it. Man, black metal guy, that last record we reviewed put me in a really weird headspace. Let's listen to something a lot more fun and uplifting. And what we've chosen to fill that crucial slot is the not even long-awaited return, because nobody ever thought that it would happen, but the surprise return of Khanate with To Be Cruel, their fourth full-length on Sacred Bones Records, which I'm not familiar with. I don't know if it's an imprint of their own or something.
No, I can explain if you want.
Oh, yeah, go ahead.
Sacred Bones is a very cool New York label that originally was centered on sort of like post-industrial and neo-folk and some straight-up industrial music. I think York Factory Complaint might have been on there. It's the other related label is Deus, did a sort of similar thing. Sacred Bones, it's weird. They sort of made a bid to... They declared indie rock dead, but in some ways ended up replacing it with their own stuff. Does that make sense?
I get that, yeah.
Yeah. So they put out some very cool stuff. They were originally more like a Cold Spring or Tesco type label with more of a sort of sort of gentler American aesthetic, which was very cool, but then they sort of branched out. Now they're just like a cool stuff label that, you know, I don't know. It's basically like Khanate putting out their record on Sacred Bones is some kind of statement. I don't know what kind of statement it is. It's probably like, you know, a gesture to the industrial scene and all of that.
Or like a pivot that we'll understand in hindsight in 3 years.
Yeah, it's like it's saying, if you're listening to this as like a sludge band, you're wrong. This is New York art metal music, right?
So for those not familiar, we talked about Khanate a little bit on the Torture Doom bonus episode. That used to be a fully Terminus Prime episode, but we unlocked that for public consumption. And Khanate is, for those unfamiliar, to any of our Zoomer listeners who haven't been on this side of the tracks before, Khanate is to metalheads, a very extreme doom band. Not immediately comparable to anything other than, like, its members' affiliated projects. Obviously, there's interaction with Sun, Burning Witch, stuff like that. Burning Witch is probably kind of the closest approximation, but Burning Witch is also still much more like a metal band.
Yeah, Burning Witch is a metal version of this.
Yes. Well, Khanete's interesting. It's like I read an interview with them on doommetal.com ages ago when they were originally active, and they very strongly affirmed that they considered themselves a doom band, which I find interesting. So they are kind of grandfathered into the metal scene, although I don't know if I could call any of their records specifically metal, at least not heavy metal, by any stretch of the imagination. What Khanate more directly comes from, I would say sort of the crux at the bottom of it is Swans. Does that sound fair?
Yeah, and that probably relates to the Sacred Bones label choice.
Yeah, so imagine a thread being followed that stretches all the way back to Swans. So we've got something that is akin to drone or funeral doom meets very out there free improv stuff, as well as sort of industrial and no wave. It's very heavy, but it's very sparse and very minimal. It is sort of vocal driven primarily. There are riffs that are hyper elongated, sort of looping chord figures positioned in very strange free time arrangements. I don't think there's anything on this record, or any of the records, that you could call a time signature proper. But all that being said, sounds fucking awful. But stick with me. Khanate rules, and I've been listening to Khanate since I was a teenager, so they're a band that are very near and dear to my heart. And it was actually a listener that clued us into this having been a surprise release, so I immediately pivoted and just really wanted to cover it.
Thanks, Mike.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. So Khanate, you and I have talked about it a little bit. We talked about sort of the weird context it comes from, of being like hyper extreme doom in some sense, but also emerging very directly out of kind of New York art scene stuff. And I played a little bit on the show, and maybe you'd heard a bit prior, and you weren't a big fan, which really surprised me last night when you called me and you said that you actually enjoyed this record.
Yeah, so we did the Khanate on the Torture Doom episode, right? That was you pointed out that Torture Doom was this. It was a place you could arrive at from a number of different places, and it was a very small group of people who were in touch with each other. And maybe the Khanate guys weren't directly part of that scene, but they were doing something very similar. Right?
Yeah.
You know, a good example would be Moss were clearly a Torture Doom band, but they came from the hardcore scene. Right?
Yeah, and there's definitely been moments in Khanate's discography where they are closer. I listened to most of their discography again in anticipation of this review, and if you go to something like the Capture and Release EP, you get something that is very close to what we would call Torture Doom. That's a much more organized record that kind of has rhythms and riffs, sort of.
Yeah, but you could say this is a Torture Doom record too. It's like it's doom, and it's very slow, and it deliberately tortures the listener. But the base material is not really doom metal in any regular sense. I don't know. So why do I like it? Well, I suppose the major objection I have to stuff like this is that the right, you said there's no real time signature. It everything exists in the space between these big unison hits, right? And you can tell they write this by sitting in the studio and nodding to each other before they do each big unison hit.
They specifically say that in an interview about their process. It's like the drummer lifts the stick in the air to indicate when the next note comes.
Well, that's pretty cool, right? And it makes jamming easier. But the point is, a lot can happen in that space, and sometimes it's boring, and sometimes it's cool, right? And on this this record, I thought it was cool. I mean, what did I not like about it? I thought that the record you played me, there was a kind of ugliness for ugliness' sake, and an interest in this sort of staggering, off-kilter feeling that, to my ear, sure, it was harsh and abrasive, but it just sounded weak. And you could say, the music is about weakness and suffering, and I could be like, okay, but if it just sounds lame, why bring this art into the world? You can make compelling music. You can make compelling, beautiful music that is also difficult, about suffering and weakness. The fact that it successfully evokes the thing did not do it for me.
Well, I mean, I'm interested to hear your take, because this record definitely evokes suffering and weakness and deliberate ugliness.
Exactly. So it's a weird thing. So, it's possible I wasn't listening carefully enough to the thing you played me, or it wasn't long enough, right? And that my long-standing cultural bias against Sun interfered with it, right?
It's fair, it's fair.
Right? B, it's possible that I listened fairly, and that some of their older records are just more attempting to be harsh and heavy, and because of this format, not really succeeding. This record is interesting because although the vocals are retching and wretched, right, and clearly designed to make us very uncomfortable, and we're really supposed to focus on the lyrics, the underlying guitar and drum materials if you're into stuff like this, it's quite beautiful. It doesn't quite have this staggering, self-interfering quality. And I don't know. Yeah, you know, what I wrote in my notes is like, has the band changed or me? I don't know. But like, it's... As far as a parallel for me, the thing I would compare this to... A lot of stuff reminded me of stuff from a record that's very near my heart that I listened to when I was really young, which is Australasia by Pelican. Sort of these very heavy major chord figures. And Pelican was a band that was really coming from outside of metal, but at that point was still interested in crushing extremity.
Yeah.
Right? Which, like, Khanate obviously is, right? They obviously respect metal and are interested in crushing extremity. The other thing it reminded me of that I've only really listened to more recently is Kowloon Walled City.
Yeah.
And Kowloon Walled City, the lyrics can be depressing, but the music is generally pretty much does what it says on the tin, right? What I was telling you before the show, it's like, you know, big, bleak, but obviously cool National Geographic photo.
Yeah.
Right? And it's very heavy sludge that is built entirely from emo parts. The chord textures are emo, the vocals are like a harder emo vocal. It's something that is it has the massive sense of metal, but it's not really built with metal parts. And an astute guy in the Bandcamp comments actually said that, and I was like, that guy's right. This Khanate record is something similar. A lot of the reference points really are just the harshest side of post-hardcore music.
I think that's worthy of note, is that there is a sort of strange rooting in post-hardcore art music stuff.
Yeah. And looping back to this, although the vocals are horrifying, right? The music really, there's a lot of major chords, brighter intervals, and there's a strange beauty to it, right? Like, they work through... I don't know. I wrote so many fucking notes for this. I'm not going to try to read off the notes. But as a general characterization, they cycle through these big chords and unison hits in this kind of meditative loops, right? And you can hear meaningful sequences of these things that kind of build on each other, then return to a sort of a starting point. And each one of them sort of chimes like a gong. And at times you can actually hear gongs. Mm-hmm. And sometimes it's not... Sometimes you get sort of like dense, complex, shoegazy type textures. Sometimes you get surprisingly bright major chords. Sometimes you get more like noble and resolute melodies that might then sort of be screwed up by the next interval or whatever, right?
Yeah.
It's not to say there aren't tons of really ugly intervals here, but if you're used to hearing ugly intervals and you're used to extreme distortion and really hot guitar tone, which I love, then this is not gonna be necessarily like you could hear this as very beautiful music, and despite the darkness of the lyrics, there's a persistent, solemn, meditative beauty that's moving at a different time frequency from the lyrics and from the subjective experience that the vocalist is sort of dramatizing here.
Yeah. Touching on the idea of these sort of broken major key phrases, you have Kowloon Walled City, which is like a weird non-metal sludge band that you're into, and then I've got the non-metal sludge band that I'm into, which is Harvey Milk. So anyone who, I know that you're not super familiar, but anyone out there who's listening who is familiar, Harvey Milk really has that propensity to use these sort of like achingly beautiful blues phrases that will be suddenly sort of shorn off and interrupted by ugly dissonant stuff. Obviously, over the course of a record, Harvey Milk has a lot more melodic, listenable material than on something like this, but there's definitely a close relationship stylistically between these two bands. Another comparison that I want to make that's a little bit more far-flung is a band that I actually like a lot, but I don't think I've ever talked about on the show. Have you ever heard of Black Sheep Wall?
No.
Okay, so
I must say.
Yeah, Black Sheep Wall is very strange in that they're kind of like a down-tempo band doing Khanate things. Most of their songs are just like crushing, slow, like funereal-paced, like open chord breakdown configurations on 8-string guitars. And the lyrics are consistently just like horrifically tortured sort of personal diatribes against various people who have wronged them.
Oh, that's good. That's good. That's a venerable tradition.
Oh, no, their second album is my favorite. It's got a bunch of like almost sort of Muppet-looking characters on it, and the title is I'm Going to Kill Myself. I appreciate the blunt simplicity of it, but there's a lot, not just musically, but about the vibe of those two bands that really congeals here. And this is an interesting thing. It's interesting to talk about a record like this on a show like this, because we can talk about timbre and texture and everything all day, and there's plenty to talk about there. But the thing that makes Khanate distinct and sort of makes it not a metal band is that the core of it is sort of fundamentally emotional and human at its root. Khanate's always had this weird reputation of being this sort of like, you know, deliberately disturbed and unsettling sounding serial killer music.
Yes, like, yes, you said this in the notes.
It's like, they're the fucking Joker, baby. You know, no. But that's never how I've connected with the band. Khanate for me has always been music about like really intense grief and depression, and specifically like disconnection from human relationships. It's more like DSBM thematically than brutal death.
Yeah, that's definitely true.
Yeah, and it's kind of hard to talk about the music without sort of addressing that specifically, because, like, as a teenager, I was severely depressed, and I got really into Khanate because...
When he says severely depressed, by the way, it's like, we've talked about, some listeners will be familiar with this, but, you know, sure, in a sense, we were all severely depressed by a teenager. Death Metal Guy was kind of on another level.
I'm still severely depressed, but in a different, more adult manner now, so it's all right. So the thing about Khanate that, like, resonated so much with me was its experience of depression felt much closer to my personal experience of it than you would get from most metal bands, which is that it's extremely negative and self-defeating and self-hating. That's the more fundamental core of it than, like, sadness or grief. Certainly, especially this record touches on those notes of sadness and grief. We've got an idea of what the album is about that we'll get to at one point. But that's always been the thing that was most interesting about Khanate, is that their exploration of depression is not in the sense of being weepy, but in the sense of being genuinely dead inside and feeling, you know, unrecoverably hopeless. Which is something also explored firmly on this record.
Well, that's a pretty good segue to the first track.
Oh God, is the first track the best? I think it is.
I think it sort of has the idea for everything else in it, right? Like, if you listened to that track, you would pretty much understand the rest of the record, right?
Yeah, this is, for those who don't know, this is a 3-song, hour-long record. All the tracks are about 20 minutes long, so it's also, I also want to bring that up because we're going to play samples. Samples fundamentally aren't done justice in music like this because this operates at such a tectonic scale. It really is necessary to suffer through the process of these songs congealing in order to make sense of their whole arc. Like, the opening track starts with, like, the intro drones are, like, 4 or 5 minutes long before anything happens. But you can't skip them or it doesn't work anymore. So let's talk about Like a Poisoned Dog. What did you? That's a fucking song title. It's holy shit.
Talks directly about feeling dead.
Yeah. So, we both sample from this one. So should we just roll into your first one?
Yep.
All right. Let's do it. Like a Poisoned Dog. Holy fuck, man.
Yeah, you always talk about schizo aesthetics, right? Yeah. So
hard schizo energy on this record.
yeah, so for those who, like me, often don't pay attention to lyrics, the lyrics there are, like a poisoned dog, not plain dead, it's dead. Oh no, that's the feeling. I feel dead. How can they do this to me? Always in my periphery.
So
the moment when I realized there was really something going on with this record was the oh no.
Oh yeah, it's like a
no.
It's a classic Sabbathism, you know?
Well, no, not just that. It was the moment that there was like profound psychological insight, right?
Yeah.
And this wasn't something attempting to be heavy and brutal or really be arty and mannered, right? There was something naked about this, like DSBM, and direct, but it is dealing with just like ugly feelings, right? And when I heard that, oh no, that's the feeling, right?
Yeah.
It's just, that calls to mind those moments when you're like, just some of the absolute nadir moments of depression, right? When you're like, because of some sort of situation or another, right? You're acting out. The whole record is about someone acting out in some sort of pathetic situation. And it's those moments where you're feeling some sort of horrible grief, but it's completely poisoned by like self-loathing and what else do I have in the, like it's grief poisoned by self-loathing and guilt.
Yeah, it's a whole morass of negative motions that produce a sort of feedback loop.
And, yes, and a feedback loop, and there's a kind of although it's a sense of losing something or obviously someone, right? There's a narcissism to it. Yeah, and paradoxically, it's also aware of its own narcissism. Yes, you're in this like, well, maybe isn't, right? Once you become aware of the narcissism, you start to work your way out of it, I think. But
I think that this record also has something to do with like negative emotions and then feeling shame for feeling those negative emotions.
Oh, for sure. That's what I mean by like grief that's tainted, right?
Yeah.
Like you feel guilty, you feel like somehow you failed, right? You're and maybe also, as we'll get to in your sample, right, there's this sort of petty impulse for revenge or sadism. And it just the oh no, that's the feeling. It just struck me as these moments of like, something different from a panic attack, but a moment of just like total existential
clarity.
Panic.
Yeah.
Total existential panic and just sort of like clawing sense of irreparable mistake.
Yes.
Right? Something you said or something that went wrong that for maybe rightly or totally wrongly is just eating at you, and every step you take that day, it's just like, oh no, that's the feeling.
It's remembering the stupid thing you said in 10th grade to that girl you liked.
Well, yeah, but like blown up to a good
to gargantuan proportions.
To gargantuan proportions. It's like, yes, it's oh no, it's just that like scream of horror was like, oh, this is real.
Well, something that sort of needs to be said about music like this, and it's going to vary for everybody, but there's a certain amount of meeting the band in the middle that has to happen to appreciate this. There's a certain suspension of disbelief. And I think it's easier for some people and harder for others. It's a little bit easier for us because we've had very similar experiences, being described here. But there's certainly a sort of person that will hear this and think it's just ridiculous. And that's like not necessarily an unfair assessment,
Yeah, like, in some sense, like, I think my initial impressions of this band weren't unfair. It's just that I didn't totally understand their musical objective. And when I was really young, some of the relevant experiences I hadn't had.
Yeah.
Right? You know,
life only got more ghoulish from there.
yeah, well, speaking, yeah, and also, yes, there is the lyrics from a certain perspective can be really cringe, but that's the point, right?
We are all cringe sometimes.
Right. The point is that there is, anytime someone in a band says, "Oh no," and you're not like, it's not like Ozzy acting, right? Like Ozzy in the movie Hexen. "Oh no, oh God, no," right? Yeah. So someone says like, "Oh no," that's the feeling, right? Like there's something sort of jarringly first personal about it.
Yeah.
And if the record were all that, I might find it too much like Dear Diary, subjective expression, blah, blah, blah. It might not succeed at the kind of titanic art it's trying to make, but I think it does, which I want to get to. But the other feeling is, there was something that segued well to your sample. I was trying to think. It's, I don't know. Just go for it.
Yeah, so we're going to go a little bit later in Like a Poison Dog. And this was, I guess you had your oh no moment, and then this one was mine, this set of lyrics, which is so, like, deeply unhappy and sincere and petty and accusatory and mean-minded at the same time. And all of those feelings are considered legitimate within this space, and I really like that. So let's go a little bit later in this track to what I think is like my pivotal moment in it. So yeah, for those who aren't able to like parse all the lyrics together when they're delivered like so slowly, that goes, the horror of a smile, a glance, or a voice. Throw that match, I beg you. Might as well. What if I looked inside? What would I see? Your thoughts, your heart, or your dreams? So this is where we kind of get into like the theme of the record, which we both arrived at independently, which is we think this is a divorce album, like pretty specifically.
Yeah, this has to be a divorce album.
The whole process of this album, all the lyrics revolve around what is clearly a specific interpersonal relationship that has collapsed completely, and it's delivered with so much conviction and so much sort of like gut-wrenching sadness and fury. It has to be like a romantic relationship dissolving. And that plays out through the whole record in interesting ways. You know, each track is a sort of different spin on the emotions associated with, you know, the destruction of a long-term relationship. You know, the first track, Like a Poisoned Dog, is particularly grief-stricken and immediately despairing. The second track is more petty and sadistic and sort of fantasizing about its own meanness in a way. And then the final track, the title track, To Be Cruel, is a sort of like awful, cold-hearted emotional calcification. Like the permanent reduction of a person in the wake of this, you know, emotional upheaval. So it's really interesting. And it means a lot to me personally because, you know, a while back I went through my own divorce situation, and it was crazy listening to some of this and listening to some of the lines and being like, oh, these are just things that I've thought. You know, which is probably troubling in its own sense, but, you know. But yeah, so I thought that I might just be projecting, but given that we both arrived at the same conclusion, it's probably safe to say that's what this centers around.
Yeah, I mean, and in a sense, that's the creepy, like, almost like if these vocals were written by a teenage GSBM vocalist in Germany, if these lyrics rather, they would be less remarkable.
Yeah.
Right. The thing that's odd is that there is some sort of, you know, guy in his late 40s or 50s who is mature, artistically sophisticated, probably self-aware. I don't know. These guys seem, you know, these guys have their shit together, right? You know?
Yeah.
Right. Who is then suddenly cast back on a reef of emotion that he may not have had to deal with since he was in his 20s.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I was just going to say, the thing that I really appreciate, you know, it's like there's something to be said for the black metal guy's philosophy of like metal being extremely and deliberately impersonal, and this runs counter to it in a sense in that it's extremely immediately personal. But I think what makes it more acceptable and brings it closer to extreme metal is the sort of like harsh objectivity of it in a certain sense, in that this is not self-edited to be merely the self-pitying, you know, look how I've suffered shit. It acknowledges all the like vicious sort of like resentment and mean-mindedness that is like not deserved or justified. The band doesn't care to do that. They just present this morass of negative emotions exactly as it happens in real life.
For sure. There is a, yes, there's an objective and analytic aspect to it. There's a coldness and distance in the way the emotions are being presented. This really isn't first-personal Dear Diary confessional music. It's almost like the vocalist is playing himself as a character.
Yeah. There's certainly a stage play thing happening.
And perhaps an exaggeration of things he actually feels, right? But nevertheless, it has this directness of expression as if a real person is saying this. And you can tell it's coming from real experience and real knowledge. it's yeah. So that's something I agree with you. There's something like daringly, nakedly personal about this, and yes, yet it works because there's that objective component to it. And I think part of it is, maybe I'll just come back to that at the end of the review. I think that'd probably be a good way to close it, about this sort of strategy. But the way it's musically, the way that objectivity is manifest in the music is in the contrast between these wretched, involuted vocals and the slow, deliberate majesty of the music.
Yeah, it is interesting how much sort of like austere beauty it manages to find.
Yes, the vocalist's paroxysm of self-loathing and other hatred is unfolding in this an indifferent and beautiful landscape.
Yeah, that's the impersonable quality of like beautiful funeral doom stuff, like skepticism.
Yeah, for sure. There's a skepticism record hiding in here, which is crazy.
Yeah.
So yeah, let's listen now to the track that you thought was the weakest, but and that actually might be, but that, like, you know, still interesting. It's the longest, and it's the middle one. It's called "It Wants to Fly." And you know, I can't even honestly remember why I chose this sample. I think
on time scales like this, it's very hard to like pin down.
I have a bunch of notes about the lyrics, but I think the sample is focusing actually on that impersonal beauty. So let's see what happens. This is well into that track. This is about halfway through that track. And really about the halfway point of the record, so that's interesting. It's another one of those midway samples like we did on the last one. And let's find out why I sampled this.
There's a light in my hand. It pulses slow. Look at the spark.
it's worth saying that as sparse and minimal as this music is, it's not that it's not detail oriented. Like the small noises and the synth pad work and the creative percussion use and those big gulfs between major unison notes really do add something. This is never boring to listen to, despite how little is happening on a moment-to-moment scale.
Yeah, there's a lot going on. And the guitar stuff is beautifully articulated.
Yeah, those are those ones that you're pointing out in the notes are very Harvey Milk.
Yeah, and so this is like, these are chords that are often being sort of like, I don't know what, it's like broken arpeggio, like broken chords or whatever, right? It's a strum that slides across all of the strings. It's so right. So the you wrote down the lyrics there, right? There's a light in my hand. It pulses slow, slow. Look at the spark. It's the very last. And under that, under the very last, you get this two big major strums, big and spacious. Boom, boom. And it's not I suppose it conveys a kind of resolution or finality, but really not the kind suggested in the "I am crushing the spark of our love in my hand" lyrics.
Well, yeah, it's also something that I appreciate about when you're talking about a band like Khanate, it's very good at doing things that are basically poisonous to metal records, like making music that is about like indecisiveness and like complete lack of emotional discipline, because like with those major strums and with the end of the lyrics, you think you're moving towards some sort of territory of true resolution, but it immediately collapses in on itself again.
Yeah, and you could actually hear that the other, that works both ways, because you hear "it's the very last," and then the strum is just all tenderness, right?
Yeah.
Right? It's like, oh, is it, bud? Right. you seem very, very keen for your ex-wife to recognize that this is the last spark, right?
Look at how little I care now. Look at it.
But the other thing there that you can hear, I'll just use the sample for this, is we should talk about the lyrics in the song, but the other thing in the sample, right, is that if you follow the guitars there and the whooshing background noises, it's certainly eerie. But that's just one of the sort of most tranquil and beautiful passages on the record.
Oh, yeah.
And it's a bleak and eerie beauty, but you can see this whole collapse happening in like a industrial loft apartment with really big windows, right?
Oh, yeah,
and a big sunny sky that moving over New York that does not care at all.
Yeah.
Right? And you can hear, it's like you can hear underneath it, you can hear the weather and the city, and you can hear the cement factory that it used to be.
Yeah. And it's how dare the world not acknowledge my pain in this moment.
Right. There is a there's a sense that there's like there's like the individual is set against these vast impersonal forces, and he's simply juxtaposed against it. He's not aware that that's around him, at least in his moment of pain, right? Mm-hmm. It's like there's layers of this character of the self that the vocalist has made doesn't know everything in the story that's being told here, right? All of this is out there over him and under him and all around him, and his individual cries of pain are in a way an expression of it, right? They wash up and down on its currents, but it's invisible to him. But we can see it and hear it.
There is. I think there's a very deliberate contrast between these highly personal individual emotions and the the sheer disinterest of the world around it. And, this sort of like partially justified, but still like narcissism springing up, completely unaware that it's not the main character,
Yeah, I like that a lot. It's high irony, right? It's not just, oh, he's sad, so he's playing a happy note, right? Which is like the snarky 18-year-old in Germany playing DSBM.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
This is it's high irony. It's he's not aware that it's not all about him, and
yeah, it's the end of the world for you, but it's Tuesday for everyone else.
right. Elsewhere, someone gets a breakfast sandwich. But more than that, elsewhere, right, the waves continue. I mean, this is, even though it's all very industrial in the specific timbres, this is oceanic sound.
Yeah,
and
yeah.
The project this kept reminding me of was another Stephen O'Malley project that I, was maybe the first thing from this circle that I found myself appreciating. Wait, am I right? Ensemble Pearl.
Okay, I
which he did with some
one.
Japanese, did with some Japanese noise musicians. I don't know why it's not on Metal Archives. It's pretty guitar driven, but it's big washes of ritualized oceanic sound that have that sort of, on this sample you could hear gong-like chimes and literal gongs, right? That gives everything this stately, meditative, breathing tempo behind the guy who can't breathe.
Yeah, yeah.
And it's like breath, and it's like the ocean, and it's interesting and cool that all of that is showing up here, and frankly in a work that's maybe a little more high stakes. I get Ensemble Pearl was like fun. This is like a very high stakes record, right?
Yeah. No, I get it. I like that. It's like, the sort of like the waxing and waning of organic matter, because everything in the organic world is constantly blooming and decaying, like you said, breath, the tides, tectonic stuff under the earth. It's constantly in motion, forward and back, over and over again. And it is really pretty to have that as the backdrop for this tale of personal apocalypse. It's very they've done a great job of not. How do I describe this? They've done a great job of avoiding the pitfalls of this kind of story. So let me go to my last sample off the title track, "To Be Cruel," and here I just want to point out some more really remarkably beautiful guitar stuff. Again, really coming from the Harvey Milk school, where it's taking a sort of basis of blues intervals, but with elaborate, almost emo-style chording, and then, shooting it in the head with these horrible dissonant noises. It's something Khanate's always done extremely effectively, and I think that they execute it phenomenally well on this track.
In the closet! The things in the world! They speak!
Okay, so, well, that really confirms our thesis about the record. Man, I read some fucking review of this record from some mass market metal publication who was like, oh yeah, To Be Cruel, it uses spiders as a metaphor for, like, human hatred and suffering. It's like, dude, this is a song about your wife moving out, and you're still finding some of the shit that she left there. Mm-hmm. It's like, it couldn't be more straightforward if it tried. This is not a record that's, like, couched in elaborate metaphor. It's a very painterly way, or maybe not painterly, but an almost sort of William Carlos Williams way of...
Yeah, minimalist poetry.
Yeah, minimalist poetry way of expressing very simple, like, real things. The lyrics for this section go, look in the closet, the things on the walls. They speak of revulsion. Something all about pain. Probably they speak all about pain. They'd cry if they could. They'd hide if they could. Under the driveway. Look in the yard. The attic and sewer. Look very hard for things. Things all around. They hide and are still. The faces are blank. So it's like, yeah, it's specifically about the experience of your partner moving out and they leave a bunch of shit there that that they don't care about, and it's up to you to throw them out, and you find little remnants over the course of months, and it sucks, and it reactivates negative feelings. I don't know, it's weird. It's cool to do a song like this about that. It's cool to, at least for a person like me, to hear about something that's so sort of prosaic yet fundamentally, like, emotionally wrenching. And I think it's really cool to do a 20-minute Torture Doom song about that. Because when you're doing it in real life, this is what it feels like.
This is
All right, we're back for the back half of this. I want to say monolithic episode, but we used to do this every week. I don't know how the fuck we survived it back then.
I think, properly speaking, it's megalithic because it has 4 big chunks.
Oh, very nice. So the back half of this episode, unusual for us, we tend to start with like the more fun shit and then get into the real weirdo territory. We flip this around. The next couple records are much more approachable in various ways. And the first one of those is Abraded with Unadulterated Perversity, released on Aggressively Uninterested. So, Abraded is not a band that I'm super familiar with. Some of the guys, or maybe all the guys, are friends of mine from my local scene, and I was able to catch a little bit of them playing live down here maybe a few weeks to a month ago. So, Abraded are from Cleveland, Ohio, so your mind immediately goes to Maggot Stomp, but that's not really what's going on here at all. Didn't this one come as a recommendation from someone on Instagram?
Yeah, this was just a listener who got in touch who was into more like, grind and brutal death stuff, and he was like, hey, check out my buddy's project. And I was like, sure. And then, we were trying to figure out an episode for this week, and I was like, hey, this actually goes pretty well with the stuff we were going to do, so let's fucking do it. Why not?
Yeah, so Abraded, I'm not familiar with the first record. This is my first time ever hearing these guys recorded. And describing it is very tricky. It's fundamentally at its core a death metal band, but there's a lot of thrash and sort of proto-grind in the mixture, as well as just like a host of kind of weirdo experimental ideas, which could come off as novelty-seeking if they weren't so authentically fucking weird all the time. To try to... I think the influences for this band are all over the map, but I'd say one that I didn't write in the notes that's just like such a direct seed I didn't even think about it until later is a band that's very important but you almost certainly haven't heard called Impetigo.
No, although it's a band I think that I hear I would like.
I think you would. I think you'd have time for it. So Impetigo were sort of like, there was a whole weird thing that happened in death metal in the late 80s and early 90s that's sort of a proto-gore grind in a way. A host of bands doing kind of death thrash grind soup with subject matter that started leaning pretty heavily into like gore and horror territory. And Impetigo were one of the really important ones to that. Now, whatever you're hearing in your head is not what Impetigo is actually like. It's kind of singular in a weird way, and there's a lineage of bands that have followed in those footsteps. For something more immediately relevant, we would look to a band like Macabre, who do a similar sort of fusion of styles, but with a little bit more direction and coherency to it. Listening to Impetigo is very weird. It's very of its time. It's not bad, but it's definitely from a very different era. And also related to that, we're going to look at some of those Pacific Northwest Razorback bands that we've talked about on the show, you know, sort of the Lord Gore circuit, but more specifically the darker, weirder edge, which would be like the Rob Fornicator bands, like Fornicator and Whore and stuff like that. And now Licentious, now that he's back from the dead. Also, we want to look at weird also-rans of old-school death metal like Infestor, which seems to be of pretty central importance here, just in the sense of, like, Infestor was a very strange death metal band that liked experimenting with different techniques from different styles of music, and moreover had a really distinct, really unhinged vocal presence on their album. Which brings us to Abraded's Unadulterated Perversity, which is a similar, like, everything in the kitchen sink approach to death metal that is guided by a genuinely, like, gorked and unsettling vocal presence that is probably going to be one of the most remarkable vocal performances this year. It is hard to... It's hard to overstate just how fucking odd and sinister and disquieting a lot of this shit is, which is funny because it's also good times party music. But we were having a conversation the other day about, we did a mini review up front. It was the name's escaping me. It was the guy from something Command, the war metal band from Chicago.
Oh, Malthusian Command.
Malthusian Command, his other project we were talking about. And we were talking about how the way to make really, like, spooky, unsettling music in metal isn't to go for the throat of what normies find spooky and unsettling. It's to do party music, but it's a really weird party and you don't understand what the social standards being conveyed are. And that's definitely the case on this Abraded record, where they're having a lot of fun, but they're having fun with things you're not supposed to have fun with. And the result is something like super alien and weird and compelling. But I've ranted enough from the perspective of a guy that's kind of into the lineage that this band is drawing from. So what do you think of as a guy that's coming in like a little bit more blank slate on it?
Well, I'm looking something up. Okay, yeah. I really liked this pretty much instantly when I heard it. I think partly the tone quality is just really cool. I like the tone. I like that it is. This isn't really. It's not D beats. It's sort of like jaunty, upbeat rock beats, right? But like fast or like like halftime D beats, but with a lot of the snare hits taken out. You know, sort of like that, sort of like they could be this sort of like, right, the sort of loping, skanking, brutal death or gore grind drums, really gore grind drums. Slow, like mid-tempo skank gore grind or coffins style D beats slow.
Yeah.
But with a lot more kind of ram-a-lam motion in the guitar between, right? Highly syncopated guitar and subdivided guitar riffing. And often almost with a boogie quality to it, right? You can almost hear like Metropolis by Motorhead or something.
There's a lot of like blues and even straight country in some of the guitar phrasings here.
Yeah, definitely some sinister redneck vibes, which is cool. In it's in terms of the party, that's a weird party, right? The whole point of being, making scary music is this is music metalheads enjoy and is might not be enjoyable for you, right? The cover has something to do with that, right? The cover is a Titian painting, so that's 16th century, late Renaissance. I didn't know that. I just Googled it. Okay. I would have thought French Romantic, but anyway, point being, it's the Flame of Marsyas, which is the satyr who challenged Apollo to a musical duel, and it's a myth about the sort of the bestial music of the satyr being subdued by the more stable and architectural music of Apollo. Right. But in the painting, the way Marsyas is being flayed is kind of as a Dionysiac ritual, like a celebration of. It's this kind of perverse celebration with a fiddle, I think. Yeah, it's Apollo playing fiddle to this sort of Apollo, god of light and beauty and art and wisdom, playing fiddle to this sort of chthonic sadistic ritual that he's presiding over, right? And that's kind of a party. So you get some. There's something interesting going on there. Yeah, it's a parallel to, it's one of those mythic recurrences of the dismemberment of Dionysus, but it's being retold in a different form. The same pattern. But so this is sort of sickening Dionysiac party music is one way of looking at it. But also, as the cover would suggest, there's something that involves it with the rest of extreme metal. It's not ghettoizing itself like the Razorback stuff. In part, it's got high art on the cover, right? And with that cover, it also links itself to a very different musical tradition that I think is closely related. So the title, Unadulterated Perversity, I was just looking at Impetigo. I think it's a nod to an Impetigo track, Unadulterated Brutality.
Oh, okay. I didn't even realize that, yeah.
But you could just as easily say Incorrigible Bigotry.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
This record has a lot to do with the Jalal bands, with Argoslant and GBK, and with an Australian band that really resembles them, which is Cauldron Black Ram, which has these, really mongoloid shuffling sort of skank beats and ornate drunken rolling flam breakdowns. Really cool stuff. And there's a kind of the perverse rock and roll vibe that is essential to all of those bands. The sort of disturbing jauntiness of it. All of that is also here. And I gotta think this record is drawing on that strand as well, which is one thing that makes it so unusual and original. This isn't just a exercise in gore extremity, right? It's got this other thing to it. And it might also help explain some of the more prog rock flights of fancy that happen here. As you point out, right, GBK is really a long, even though it has kind of what we hear as punk beats, right, it's really a long hair band.
Yeah, no, I think that's, and I think that what we're both kind of getting at is that both of these bands, both, Galal bands and Abraded, have this distinct appreciation for a sort of odd Americana translated into extreme metal. Yeah, so I mean, because definitely, Galal's guitar techniques are so heavily oriented around blues phrasing and kind of country and western phrasing. And it's similar here on Abraded. That is, and Abraded even goes further. There's stuff that's almost just like Southern Fried Pantera riffs on here sometimes, but just...
Oh, no, there is.
Presented in a totally bizarre, unsettling context. Going back to that idea of, party music, but for, the wrong... a social group that you don't belong to, Well, let's get into playing it, because it's just like, this is fascinating music. I will say, this record is just over a half hour long, and it is a wild fucking ride from beginning to end.
And there are a lot of statements here, but not like in a pretentious way. They're just, they immediately deliver on themselves, right? There are a bunch of funny gestures that just immediately pay off. So one of them is that the first two tracks are just bangers, and they're almost identical. They're based around exactly the same, rhythmic idea. They're like, hey, you liked that? Good. So here's the second track, all of it. It's called Nothing, or most of it. It's called Nothing Left to Lose.
You definitely listen to Macabre, Fornicator, and Whore. There's like, even listening again, there's like even more parallels than I realized at first.
Yeah. I'm listening back to confirm something that I thought was really cool in the sample. Oh yeah, so, they move through this dissonant, like, right? Which could just be the that's like Protest and Survive, basically. But they do, there's a second version of it that is where the song really intensifies, where we were both kind of like, yeah. Yeah. And that's where they go, dog, and so they go like that minor sixth down to like, I think probably like, dun, 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 dun. Yeah, like minor sixth down to a minor third, right? That's like more epic heavy metal interval or a Misfits interval, right? And it's kind of an abrupt change in the harmony, like that happens sort of mid-riff, but the drummer marks it off in this really cool way, so that there's just a huge downbeat heaviness to it.
This is 100% jam session writing. Mm-hmm. This is, like, the way these songs are organized is very off the cuff and weird. They tend to be like short, kind of minimal songs based off of just a couple riffs, but then they play with the contours of them in a really interesting way.
Yeah, and similarly, like, the song is sort of, I mean, this is very simple sort of gang vocal punk song format, right? Nothing left to lose chant. Okay, cool, that's catchy. But, it's still got this, it's got the variation in the riff. It's got then this, like, early death metal sort of ripping section in the middle, solo. It's actually got a lot of stuff going on. But mostly what it does is it just, like, reminds you why you liked the Caius songs with the guy who did all the coke.
yeah. There's a
you know what I mean. Like,
there's dark side weed energy afoot here,
for sure. Yeah, but who's the member of Caius who was like the more like the real punk?
Oh, I don't know. I don't know
Yeah,
Kaya
yeah.
super well.
Yeah, or not Kaya. Sorry, Queens of the Stone Age. He
Oh,
was in
okay.
Queens of the Stone Age for a minute. My bad, guys.
Yeah, I'm not sure about that one. So one thing that's also interesting. So let's talk about the vocals, and let's talk about how the primary vocal for this song, which is not necessarily the primary vocal for any of the other songs, there's a lot of different styles, is a weird reverbed hiss. You know, like an almost like quietly delivered hissing growl, and the lyrics are just like nihilistic blue collar misery. Of just like, you stole my car, you stole my money, I've got nothing left to lose. This sort of like weird preparatory statement for all the hideously violent shit that's going to happen later in the album, which is, again, an extremely Rob Fornicator thing. Like, all of his lyrics on Fornicator and Horror are these weirdly blunt, like, anal cunts declarations of contempt and like simple brute violence that end up being weird because they're not gussied up in any way. It's just, you know, stories of horrible people doing horrible things and not particularly smart ones, which makes it weirder and grosser somehow. And I really
More
appreciate that
plausible.
vibe. Yeah. So continuing on the vocals, you're going to hear a bunch more wild vocal stuff, including shit that I've, like, never heard before outside of super niche bands. Some of the gorier vocals really remind me of Catasexual Urge Motivation, which always had this strange, like, groaning quality. And then there's really effects-treated stuff that the only comparison that immediately springs to mind would be Retaf Ruo, Our Father backwards, a totally gorked weirdo industrial USBM band that very few people know about, but where the vocals were these like strange arrhythmic hisses with way too much reverb and delay on them. They almost don't sound like a person. They're just like steam escaping a machine or something. And the fact that these guys are into some of those ideas is like super interesting to me. And it really adds to the overall kind of unnerving feeling of this record. So let me go to another song, another kind of jaunty number. This is the fourth track, The Hill Snatch. Again, we're reaching back into that sort of like Americana, like Hills Have Eyes type thing. So this track feels like an attempt to execute on the promises of Lord Gore to do this sort of gross fun time party death metal band, but the difference is that Abraded is staffed by insane people who can't keep a song together coherently. This is a 2-minute track that completely falls apart in a super demented way halfway through. what the fuck is going on? It's like they reintroduce the verse riff, but just like twice, and then massive tempo drop into this strangely beautiful lead section with like the wah guitar, and there's just sounds that pop up, just these sound objects, like something that sounds like a musical saw or like a thunder sheet or something that just erupts in the very end there. All the strange channel switching with the vocals just like circling around the musical space. It's super, super weird. And I'm really here for it. You know?
This has more in common with the Khanate record than one might imagine.
It's funny
like that passage on the track the second track I sampled, right?
Yeah, there is literally a thunder sheet on that record, and it's like, how the fuck are these two bands getting into? Yeah, let's use a thunder sheet in an extreme metal record at the same time, dude. Like, but a lot of the record sounds like this. It's like, a lot of the record is based around the same basic riff idea, which is, this sort of thrashy, palm-muted run with a very strange bluesy turnaround. And yet it never gets boring, even though, like, all of these riffs are sort of fundamentally structured in the same way. Because the context around them just keeps shifting in these unexpected directions, and then that sort of repeated riff idea becomes like an anchor to build the record around, which is just a very strange way to organize a death metal album.
I mean, the whole way the song sort of cancels itself in order to start this, like, what you think is going to be this elaborate Galal exposition, right, of some, like, neoclassical guitar idea or a big bluesy prog solo. And then they don't even that cancels itself, right? It's just like, fuck it. You can almost hear them go, fuck it.
Yeah, right? It's like it is a clear, like, deliberate musical joke being played.
Yeah. Yes, there are constant musical jokes throughout this record, but they're always actually funny and sound good.
Yeah, that's the thing. It's like you can do music that is funny that is also cool.
Yes. Yeah, there's a lot of sick... it's like what you were saying about the party that's not so fun for most people, right? There's a lot of sick laughter here.
Yeah. And it's also something that takes advantage...
Right, the original sense of sarcasm.
Yeah, and it takes advantage of, like, you as a metalhead and your expectations for the... Because none of these jokes would be coherent to anyone outside of, like, deep reaches of death metal. So it's like this very strange set of inside jokes that are combined with, like, weirdly serious music at the same time. So, I don't know. The whole record's like this. It's just constant, like, left field shuddering of expectations, weird sound objects. There's something odd happening in every track.
It's like, this is like a record. It's not on the face of it one of those bands that obviously read Cosmic Curse, but it reads like a kind of band that, like, it's like a much more fully realized version of the kind of weirdo bands that would sometimes make their way onto that blog, right? Hey, here's this weird-ass band that sounds like, it sort of sounds like brutal death metal, but also prog rock. I don't really know how to describe it. Here it is.
It's like if Rusty Axe Records had a straight death metal band.
I actually was going to say Rusty Axe, right? Because we were saying Razorback earlier, right? And... yeah, it's like the good version of, or the best version of the Razorback stuff, and like a better in a lot of ways, right?
Yeah.
And Rusty Axe I was thinking too, and I wasn't sure. I was like, oh wait, that's black metal, but this totally has something in common with that.
Yeah, it definitely does, because, the whole philosophy of Rusty Axe Records was, it's sort of like loosely rooted in a kind of raw black metal, but it especially appreciated bands that refused to play by the established rules. Yeah. And there's something... go ahead.
The sort of bleak, sort of trailer park Satanism vibe, right?
Yeah, which is also something that's kind of occurring here. Except here it's more like, deformed hillbilly shit, which is cool. I mean, the Hills Have Eyes, is like a vibe that more death metal bands should explore. I mean, why not?
So let's listen to another one. This is from towards the end of the record. imagine, if you will, a parallel universe in which this one is forced inoculation.
God, those are weirdly shaped riffs.
Yeah, those are sick riffs.
Oh, no, they're great.
Yeah, so how would you describe... how would you describe the weird shapes?
So those are going to be kind of connected to the weirdest parts of Impetigo. Just the very strange, like, you know, death metal riffing hasn't fully coalesced into a particular set of, like, rhythmic ideas. You know, it's still kind of working with root material from thrash, but it's trying to extend beyond itself. And just the strange sliding chords. You know, a lot of this probably also has to do with Repulsion, although Repulsion's more of a straightforward death grind band. I don't know. I'm really curious as to what these guys listen to, because there's just so many possibilities nested in this music, pulling on fringe death metal stuff throughout history, but centered around the late 80s and early 90s.
Yeah, it's that riff is weird also just from the way it doesn't start. It's like the kind of riff that usually starts on the root note, but it does not. Right? It's this sort of like step descent. It almost sort of like flirts with being a chord progression and then throws this huge flourish. I mean, the huge flourish is another Galal type thing, right? That's like, and also just I don't know, like the most elaborate parts of thrash or power metal cropping up in early death metal tracks, right?
Yeah, it's all over the map, but it really is kind of this unified aesthetic that binds all these disparate elements together. This mishmash of like high art meets VHS horror film stuff, which I guess I'm just describing death metal at this point, right?
Stop